It's been nearly 10 years since EA last dipped their toes into the survival horror genre, and until rather recently, it was safe to assume that they never would do it again. Their last project in the survival horror genre being the highly anticipated and much debated Dead Space 3. The series that had once been at the pinnacle of survival horror with Dead Space and then later at an even higher peak with Dead Space 2, had fallen prey to EA's predatory microtransaction systems, and the never-ending greed to expand to an ever bigger audience. Dead Space 3 leaves a sour taste of betrayal in people's mouths, and many thought that this would be the last time we saw anything from this series. But with the release of Resident Evil 2 Remake, a new trend in gaming emerged: the faithful modern remake. By simply remaking the game from the ground up, you could repurpose an IP that already had a built-in audience in a way that gives you the benefit of the doubt. This is exactly what EA needed to get back into the survival horror genre. And a few years later, Dead Space Remake was announced. Having had the chance to play this remake over the last week or so, I have come to the conclusion that it might just be the best remake of a game ever made. As a fan of the Dead Space franchise, it's the perfect time to revisit the classic in a way that is refreshing and new. But it's also the perfect time for the game to come out if you're a speedrunner too. Or at least it seemed that way at first. The Dead Space speedrunning community has seen insane growth since 2020. What was essentially 3 completely dead games with close to zero activity have been transformed into 3 very cool speedruns with a cult following. The original Dead Space had its run cut down over an hour since 2020 due to its speedrun revolution and the power of the pulse boost. Dead Space 2 would also be completely revolutionized, going under an hour for the first time in 2022. And Dead Space 3 would even receive its own cutscene skip mod, alongside a ton of new glitches that cut the run down a considerable amount. With these revolutions coming to their natural conclusions just months before the release of the Dead Space remake, the entire speedrunning community was prepped and ready to absolutely obliterate the remake the instant it came out. And immediately, it seemed like this could potentially be the most broken Dead Space yet. The game itself is phenomenal. Every piece of content that was in the original is also in the remake. Plus, there was tons of side content added in for good measure. Plenty of things were redone and rebalanced, but every single piece of content that was adjusted to be made better. In my opinion, this is the best remake ever made, dethroning the original RE1 remake. One might think that because of this game's faithfulness to the original, that potentially some of the same speedrun tech and glitches would also be preserved. But this is simply not the case, as this game is made from scratch, on an entirely new engine with entirely different staff, at an entirely different time. It was also programmed for entirely different hardware. It's important to remember that speedrun glitches and tech usually stem from oversights and weird interactions between multiple systems overlapping in ways that were not intended. When these systems are remade from the ground up, they're often remade with completely different methods, causing them to overlap in completely different ways. From a speedrunning perspective, this game may as well be considered a completely new game with no ties to any others. Virtually no assumptions can be made about the glitches or speedrun tech. Starting completely fresh is a great way for people to get revitalized and get new eyes on a franchise's speedrun potential. With the Dead Space community right off the back of so much testing and progress in the other games, they were prepped and ready to do the same in this one. Right away, tons of discoveries were made that would in theory turn the game into an absolute broken mess. The very first few things that were tested were tricks and glitches used in previous Dead Space games. Falling off of elevators, clipping through walls in 0G, and using low frame rate to clip through doors and walls. But as I said before, this is a remake. The entire game's code was redone from scratch on an entirely different engine. So while it's important to at least try these things that worked in past games, the likelihood of them actually working were slim to none. 0G clipping did look like it was going to work at first, but neither high nor low FPS could get Isaac's fat head through these walls. But as early as people's first playthrough, there were glimpses. Small signs of what could be. Old tricks not working was no surprise, but it was a sign of the times. Knowing Dead Space though, it was bound to be a broken mess. We just had to figure out the new ways to break the game. The first one is probably one that you would only expect from a Source game. And no, it's not bunny hopping. It turns out, in the re-implementation of Kinesis into the remake, they gave much more weight and permanence to the objects in the world. And by doing so, they made Isaac able to prop fly. By putting a prop underneath Isaac with Kinesis, then standing on top of it, you can have Isaac fly through the air. It's really hard, and not nearly as useful as prop flying in games like Half-Life 2. But it was certainly a start. Once again, my YouTube comments will be filled with people not knowing that Isaac had a falling animation. The earliest implementation of this trick would be on Chapter 3 to skip a small elevator. Only a 30-second time save, but the implementation of this trick would mean endless possibilities for new time saves throughout the run. The tech did have a few limitations though. There are only a handful of kinesisable objects in the game that are actually big enough to push Isaac, and even fewer of those are small enough for Isaac to climb on top of. Isaac can only get on top of objects that are up against walls or some surfaces that stop objects from moving, because you can't look perfectly straight down. Once on top of the object, it's very hard to control where you're going, and most railings in this game have a built-in overhang to stop you from going over top of them. Going over walls wasn't the only practical application that was found for props in the early days though. Going through invisible walls was also possible. Most platforms in Dead Space Remake that have an open edge have a soft invisible wall on them that stops Isaac from walking off of them and potentially getting stuck. Kinesis objects don't interact with these walls, so they can go right through them. So by dragging an object into yourself, you can push Isaac through these walls and out of bounds. This immediately had immense implications in the run. The first place this was discovered to be possible was in Chapter 2's Medical Deck Tram Station. The original Dead Space was a level-oriented game, where you go from level to level by taking these trams. In the remake, you still do so, but the Ishimura is one big interconnected world, with the tram physically moving you from place to place. Spicy discovered that you could use these big blue boxes to push Isaac through the invisible walls and onto the tram tunnel. All parts of the game are accessible from this tunnel, so by breaking into it, in theory, you could go to a much later point in the game, skipping a huge amount of the game. Prop clipping, then flying through the tunnel, Spicy went over one station to Chapter 10, skipping essentially 8 chapters of this 12-chapter game. Or so we had hoped. But it seems this game is a bit more smart about its triggers than the original. In the original, there are usually only 1 or 2 triggers that you have to hit to progress the game, then you head back over to the tram and onto the next level. You could do these in any order and however you wanted to. Normally, you would pulse boost through the ceiling and right to the objective. If the remake worked the same way, then you could in theory skip right to Chapter 10 and finish that chapter. But it doesn't. You see, when we got to Chapter 10, there was a problem. You could collect the objectives and things would seemingly work, but the user interface never updated with new objectives. And when it came time for cinematics or cutscenes, they just didn't play. We could, on the second day, skip all the way to Chapter 10, but doing so just did nothing. It was just an empty set of rooms with no enemies, no active triggers, and no future for the speedrun. Not only that, but if you went back to complete Chapter 2 and played the rest of the game to Chapter 10 and tried to complete it normally, the game would then soft lock. The objectives you already did before wouldn't update and there would be no way to progress. This was a potentially huge problem. But for the moment, we were not just sure of how big the problem would be. This is when the biggest discovery yet would be found. At the very start of Chapter 3, Hammond opens up this hangar door for Isaac, removing the gravity in the room. On the left side of this room, you can hug the wall and there's a certain spot where the game will deload the area. When the area is deloaded, the collision and textures for the area disappear. The 0G and lack of oxygen in this case are still present, but this puts you out of bounds, with 0G. In Dead Space 2, the way 0G works is that there is a bounding box around the area where Isaac is inside, and the 0G applies to him during this section. And when you leave this bounding box, Isaac immediately loses 0G properties and falls to his death. But in the remake, the process works exactly backwards. When Isaac enters the 0G area, the 0G is applied to him, instead of him walking into the area where 0G is applied. Then, when he leaves the room through the door that he's supposed to leave the 0G properties from, they are removed from Isaac. You might see how this is massively important distinction. If the 0G properties are only removed from Isaac when he leaves through the intended door, then he will keep the 0G state forever, unless he goes through that door. And because the Ishimura is one giant interconnected level, bingo. That means you can, in theory, fly to wherever you want from the 0G in Chapter 3. We had essentially discovered a way to go anywhere in the game from Chapter 3, and I mean anywhere. As it was discovered that even Chapter 12 on the planet was loaded in as early as Chapter 3. There were just 2 problems though. For one, Isaac also has the vacuum property applied to him when getting into this deload. This means that he has limited air and when he runs out, he'll die. And 2, the area is pitch black. Isaac glows a bright white when out of bounds like this, but every area of the game is deloaded. This means you are navigating with absolutely 0 visual cues at all. literally flying blind. This problem was quickly solved. If you fly backwards toward the start of the level, you will eventually back out of the vacuum, as this bounding box is a property like 0G in Dead Space 2. Now, with the unlimited air, you could fly anywhere. Or, well, you could if you could fucking see. In order to be able to navigate this void, we needed to come up with some alternative methods. The properties of this deload was unique to the remake. It turns out if you get close to an area, you can cause it to load in visually, but you have to be very, very close. If you fly into an area quickly, you can actually have it load in behind you and get right into the room, which is actually perfect because that makes it easy to get back in bounds when flying in out of bounds 0G. I managed to come up with a setup to fly perfectly straight down towards the tram station just by memorizing the object's position in relationship to each other. From here, I could do something special. I could fly just close enough to load in the tram station, but not so close that I lose 0G. Because this was another issue. If you came into contact with an area that wasn't supposed to have 0G, then Isaac's 0G properties would update, removing his 0G and sending him into the abyss, or in this case, on top of the ceiling. By being able to keep 0G while being able to see though, I could explore a few more areas. Rampancy, who originally found the deload, was able to load in Chapter 6 boss fight and kill it, and it would actually let him leave the arena. But just like Chapter 10, the objectives would not update. I was able to fly into Chapter 7 elevator and try some objectives there, but alas, no updates either. This led us to believe that it was simply impossible to skip any objectives in this game, or it would simply cause a softlock, instantly dashing our dreams of having any full chapter skips, let alone potentially skipping from Chapter 3 to Chapter 12. Later that day, Demented Salad, Wasted, Meta, and HNTD would collaborate to create a cheat engine table that allowed us to see the X, Y, and Z coordinates of Isaac. With this new tool, we could then fly through the 0G in the deload and actually be able to tell where we were. Once we were able to collect the positions of the places that we actually wanted to go to, we could just fly there in relatively a straight line as long as we didn't hit anything on the way there. Radish would then find the coordinates of Chapter 12's planet and proceed to make the 6.5 minute fly there. The theory was that if you could fly from Chapter 3 to Chapter 12, maybe those triggers would work, because it's an entirely different area, one so far away that there's no way you could accidentally get there in any sort of normal play. Maybe that would cause the triggers to work for some reason, a small oversight of some sort. It seemed like cope, but maybe you could kickstart the game's objective system from there. Once he arrived though, he shared the same sad news that we had received on Chapters 6, 7, and 10. None of the objectives updated. Just like that, the game's potential for a super fast speedrun instantly disappeared. Semi-open world games like Halo Infinite and Dead Space Remake have some insanely short speedruns sometimes, by being able to skip right through the world space and activating things later on that you can sometimes use to do huge sequence breaks. This is a rather divisive thing though. What is ultimately super fast is not always the most fun to perform. I myself much prefer Halo Infinite's all missions category to its any percent speedrun. In that game, you do the first 2 missions, then perform a huge skip across the open world and right into the last 2 missions, sequence breaking almost right to the end of the game. This makes for a somewhat boring any percent speedrun that, while fast, isn't as fun to perform as other categories. Dead Space Remake was one small change away from having almost the exact same run. Doing the first 2 missions as intended, then a 6.5 minute fly out of bounds straight to the end of the game, then doing the final mission normally. But because of this implementation of the objective system, this was not the type of speedrun that Dead Space Remake would have. With more and more potential sequence breaks being tested, every single one of them ending in softlock, it really did seem like this idea was doomed. The run itself would be mostly glitchless, and you wouldn't be able to skip nearly anything. The only tricks being found was prop flies to skip small sections. At least that's how it seemed for the first 2 days. Then we started finding more and more things that would add up to insane amounts of time. First, it was found that you could turn on toggle aim in the settings and have toggle sprint off, and when you do so, aiming and let go of aim and holding sprint makes you actually run 16% faster than normal sprinting speed. That is a huge time save across a run this long. That's 3 seconds of time save over 18 seconds in movement speed alone. On top of that, you could reload and even shoot the Ripper without losing any speed. Alongside this, I also discovered a small out of bounds glitch that actually saved some time in Chapter 4. By prop flying out of bounds, you can get into this corner and then get a deload. From there, you can fall and pause the game at the right time to have the level load in around you. This skips some required combat and some elevators, saving almost 20 seconds. The biggest discovery yet would come next, as it is discovered that you can actually skip all of the in-game cutscenes that play from Isaac's rig. These are normally called rig videos. You have to sit there and listen to people yap all day while doors and elevators remain locked. This locks you out of progression for a lot of the time and makes the run a lot slower. In the original Dead Space, these are just video files that you can delete to remove from the game, instantly saving an upward of 7 minutes. But in the remake, there is no such method, and they lose easily over 25 minutes in total. It was later found out though that you can bring up a previously played rig video and play it before a required one starts. Doing so then overlaps them, and when you close the old rig video while the new one is playing, both of the rig videos close, skipping the new one and allowing you to progress. This can be done for almost every single rig interaction throughout the game, and it makes the pacing of the run much better, eliminating a ton of downtime. Some people still believe that some objectives must be able to be skipped. We just haven't figured out which ones just yet. I had proved that you could skip some side mission objectives when I was doing some testing in Chapter 7 early. I was on a New Game Plus file, and with that I had the master clearance already. With this clearance, I was able to open a door and grab a key item that was locked behind a door that required master clearance. When I grabbed it, it updated and skipped a ton of side quest objectives. This led me to believe that if you have a clearance for a door early, that the objectives behind them might not be locked to this strict progression like regular objectives are. To test this, I decided to clip into the room locked behind level 2 clearance in Chapter 4. Unfortunately, it didn't update, and I was just locked behind there, unable to skip anything. Nearly every objective in the game was tested, and it seemed that none of them would work. But while we couldn't skip objectives, that didn't mean we couldn't find skips at all. A random YouTube video called Dead Space Out of Bounds Glitch was found, and it showcased some interesting new tech. By letting go of kinesis while trying to pull a large object towards yourselves, the object will gain insane speed, and can even push objects through the wall if you let go at the correct time. This was a huge discovery. These boxes were everywhere in the game, and with such abilities, they instantly became the most useful item in the entire game. By using the 2D map, you could locate what locations were near each other in 3D space, and with these box clips, you could drop straight to the floor and land in new areas. This is where the first big skip was found in Shockpad Skip. Chapter 2's medical deck has you collecting 2 items, some thermite from the 0G area and the shock pad from the surgery section. Instead of going through the level normally though and fighting in a quarantine room, you could instead box clip through the floor and land right where the shock pad is. This ended up skipping about 2 minutes of combat. Once this was tested a little bit more thoroughly, it turned out that it actually worked. There was no soft locks associated with it. So while you couldn't skip objectives entirely, you could definitely skip some things. This is just the reorientation of mindset that the Dead Space speedrunning community needed when looking for new sequence breaks in this game. Instead of looking for huge, big skips that skipped large sections, we started looking for what was the fastest way to get from point A to point B. Point B being the next objective. It didn't matter how we got there, just whatever way was faster. And as it turns out, there is a lot of really cool and unique ways to get from point A to point B. MapMap discovered that you could shoot through doors to break fuses open, saving large amounts of time in many different places, and creating little in-game shortcuts. In Chapter 7, it was discovered that you could use this box to clip through the processing door to grab the engineering rig, skipping the entire 0G section, and then immediately after that, you could clip through the wall and land where the SOS beacon is. This skips a long gondola ride and defending Nicole, saving nearly 4 minutes. After this, it was found that you could clip through another wall in Chapter 5 to skip right to the comms array in Chapter 8, saving a ton of time on traversal and combat during Chapter 8. In Chapter 6, there were 7 Weezer fans that you have to kill before you could fight the boss, but the last one has a huge track around a 0G section, and through a fire room to get to it. But you can actually just break the tentacles that guard it from the other side with the pulse rifle alternate fire, saving another 2 minutes. Then on Chapter 3, there was a skip I found where you skip going back on the gondola and instead jump over a railing and land on the backside of a 0G room, giving Isaac 0G long enough to fly to the next objective. Over the next few days, there were more small and large skips that would be found, and it seemed like even if there was no possibility of skipping objectives, the game could still be very broken. Just like all of the other Dead Space games, there is a ton of cool tech and speed potential, but the Dead Space remake would never be close to the speeds of Dead Space 1 or 2. That was, unless something really big was found. With the tricks and skips that we had currently found, sub 2 hours was not possible. 2.5 hours was a good run. This is with a lot of the tricks and skips that I have discussed in this video already being implemented and hitting most of the rig cutscene skips. With proper execution and practice, you can probably bring it down to a low 2-hour run. But even then, that's a far cry from the 58-minute Dead Space 2 run and the 1 hour and 8-minute Dead Space 1 run. Both of those games have large sequence breaks that cut tens of minutes off the run. But for now, it seems that we'll just have to keep chipping away at this game. Or it seemed that way until this skip was found. As it turns out, not all objectives are created equal. In fact, some objectives exist that are obsoleted due to other things being in your way and then come back later. This is exactly what happens in Chapter 10. The first objective of Chapter 10 is to reach the executive shuttle. You need to put a part into the shuttle that you got from Chapter 9 and then use it to take the marker off of the Ishimura. But on your way there, a doctor stops you and has you do some side objectives first. As it turns out though, the objective right at the start of the level and right at the end of the level are the same objective. And if you never trigger the middle objectives, then you can just skip right to the completing of the last one. By using the same methods that we use at the end of Chapter 5 to get out of bounds, you can land on the roof of the comms array and get 0G. Right above this room is the end of Chapter 10. So by simply flying through the floor, you can land right where you need to be at the end of the chapter. Everything works properly with no soft locks. This skip saves over 10 minutes in the speedrun and is the first instance of being able to properly sequence break anything. As for right now though, it's the only instance of it. But with the way the objectives are laid out, there is potential for a few more. And maybe with this, we could see our first ever run in under 2 hours. With the game only a week old, there has already been so many discoveries in the Dead Space remake. And knowing the Dead Space speedrunning community, there are sure to be many more discoveries in the future. Thanks so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Stay stylish.